Yes, passage number 2. Here we go. So, as you know, I will be doing this passage timed for 10 minutes. I have the timer here. Don't worry if you can't follow along all the way, but please do pay attention to how I do this in real time. Then we'll slow down and go back over the passage together step by step. All right, let's jump into it. Take a deep breath and go. So I see choices, free will, choice, deliberate, restaurant ordering, choices. Okay, so it's about choices, free will, stuff like that. So maybe something like a philosophy. Let's say it's humanities. So if it's humanities mixed in with a little bit of psychology, I'd say it's probably going to be a bit more of an opinionated passage. So as we know, opinionated passage is going to have not just some description of X relating to Y. It's going to be having some opinion that, you know, this thing over here is more important than this thing over here. So I want to find out what is that sort of comparison, what does the author think is very important, and why. Let's try the conclusion. Let's see. So regardless of whether or not there is such a thing as choice, identity, or free will, a more prudent paradigm to consider is the acceptance of one's inherent inadequacy with respect to information processing. Okay, so the main thesis I'm predicting here has to do with that accepting your own inadequacy when it comes to processing information is more important, more prudent, more wise thing to consider. Whether or not there is a choice, identity, or free will, that's not very important. Okay, great. So life is made up of choices. This is in air quotes here. So this represents the cornerstone of modern day anxiety. All right. So the whole passage I'm understanding is going to be about exactly that. Choices and then the anxiety that it causes. So it says this represents. So this sort of choice represents the cornerstone of modern anxiety, and regardless of whether or not there is such a thing, it's much more wise to accept your own inherent inadequacy when it comes to processing information. Okay, so as it relates to anxiety, now let's go ahead and see the layout of the passage. There's 5 paragraphs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now obviously there's a shift in tone here, but let's see. So it seems that each choice is blah blah blah. In these situations, the process you use must be examined. Okay, must be examined. That seems to be a very opinionated thing to say. Take an example of blah blah blah. Take an example. Choices of what to think. Okay, so I'm saying that maybe the shift in tone is somewhere in paragraph 3, because examples are usually contextual, but then again, it could be evidence. So let's say it's paragraph 3. So we're going to say that the first shift in tone is going to be somewhere over here. Now I predicted that. Now I have to validate it. So that means that the context would be somewhere here, evidence would be somewhere here, and the conclusion would be here, obviously. All right. So I'm going to pause at the top here before I go top down. And what I'm doing is I'm just reminding myself what the thesis is. Okay. So the thesis is again that it's really important to consider and accept your own inherent inadequacy with respect to information processing. So my questions are, why is it more prudent? And how does the author prove this? Right? Why is this more prudent, and how does the author prove it? All right, so now that I have those questions of why this is a very important thing to consider, now I need to read top down. All right, deep breath. Let's go. Choices of what to think, what to say, how to feel, what to consume, and so on permeate our daily lives. The choice for me to write this essay right now seems totally incontrovertibly of my own doing. There does not seem to be any other actor in the picture that forces my hands to transcribe the thoughts buzzing in my mind. Whether small decisions of what words to choose or large decisions of which direction to take my life, it is captivating to think that as we flow on in time, we are at the helm. And yet, I've been waiting for that, okay, and yet, so the first shift in tone is not in paragraph 3, it's actually in paragraph 1. And yet, quite often, the direction in which we end up does not bring about internal satisfaction. How can this be so? How can I, with myself steering the ship, lead myself to a state of being that I do not enjoy? All right, we're going to pause here real quick. So now I want to connect the first shift in tone, that thesis, to the thesis that I predicted from the conclusion. So the combination of those two things represents the main point of the passage. So the fact that we bring ourselves, that the direction we end up does not bring about internal satisfaction, is why it's important to consider accepting our own inherent inadequacy with respect to information processing. That makes perfect sense. So the fact that, hey, we're not perfect when it comes to processing all information, that's why we end up where we don't want to sometimes, and that's okay. All right, excellent. So now let's read the rest of the passage to kind of see examples and more proof on that. But basically, we have the layout. So the conclusion is down here. First shift in tone is up here, and this is all your proof. And of course, some context is up here. So take an example of ordering in a restaurant. You're driving to the restaurant, contemplating which dish you will order. You are aware of the options of the restaurant. You're aware of your plans of becoming physically slimmer and healthier. You are aware that in the past you have tended to order less healthy options. You take all of these into consideration and decide that you would eat the salad. When you enter the restaurant, you approach the counter and end up selecting a burger instead. Why? What changed? In these situations, the process you use must be examined. Okay, that's another important factor. One common issue occurs when trying to plan for future behavior outside the situation of when the behavior will occur. Your mind is not thinking about all the factors that will influence you in the moment for which you are deliberating. Because you planned to eat a salad while you were on the road, you are at risk for not including all of the inputs and variables necessary, such as the smells, the order that the other person placed, the recommendations of the order taker, or the compelling designs of the menu. So it seems that each choice a person makes is a combination of the information consciously processed at the time of deliberation, along with the information subconsciously processed during the actual event itself. Intuitively, it is easy to accept that not all variables are taken into account, especially, there's an emphasis word, when tied to an event as insignificant as ordering a hamburger instead of a salad. To go about improving this process would mean to accept that there is a process that needs improving in the first place. On the other hand, here we go, shift in tone, the identification of you with your choices and the consequences of those choices muddles the internal satisfaction with oneself as the captain for choices that are apparently more significant. Exactly. Okay, so it's fine for us to accept that we're not great at taking into consideration all the variables. That's easy for us to accept when it's tied to something insignificant. But when it's tied to something more significant, then all of a sudden we get confused and we start to doubt our own ability to make choices for ourselves. And that's why the author thinks it's much more prudent to consider and accept that we're going to be inherently inadequate. All right, cool. Let's blast through these problems because I only have like a minute and a half left here. So what is the most likely reason that the author used the example? Okay, it's an example problem of ordering a restaurant, so that's right here. So it's going to be this, and then it's going to be whatever the claim was before. So quite often the direction does not bring about internal satisfaction. So let's see. To demonstrate our incomplete decision-making process, not bad. To illustrate how our decisions can lead us to satisfaction. Yep, that's the claim that was made before, so A is weaker. C, to set up context for the claim that life is made up of choices, not as good. Exemplify the level of detail necessary when examining, not as good. So B is pretty straightforward. Point the author is trying to make is, again, it's right there. So the pursuit of improving our information processing capabilities is worthwhile, not so much. Our intentions are not always in our best interest. I guess that's not really the point, but that's better than A. That sometimes there are choices in life that are made for us instead of by us. That's a little bit better. To loosen the sense of self-worth tied to the outcomes of our choices. Yes, it's about self-worth and our internal satisfaction that we feel dissatisfaction that we feel when we make bad choices. Oops. So not C, it's D. Imagine that a person begins questioning their ability to master a subject because of a recent poor test score. How would the author likely respond to this person? Well, they would respond by saying it's much more prudent to accept the fact that you're inherently inadequate, and that doesn't mean that you have to be dissatisfied with you being the captain of your own choices in the future. So it is perfectly reasonable that you failed, but this does not mean you're incapable of improvement. Yeah, exactly. That sounds great. I'm running out of time, so that seems like it'd be the best one. Which of the following claims would be least supported by the passage? So whichever one is not a claim that was made. The ideas of choice, identity, and free will are illusions. No, because the passage said regardless of whether or not those things are exist. So this is not supported by the passage. Suppose research in neuroscience conclusively proves that choices we make are predetermined prior to our becoming aware of them. How would this information affect the author's argument? Again, it's the same thing that we just read here, that just because neuroscience proves that that choices are illusions, right? That doesn't mean that affects the author's argument, because the author's saying regardless of whether or not there is such a thing as choice. So again, it would not. So this is weaken, support, and then redundant. So I would say not affected. That's the one. So A is the right answer here. All right, let's stop and slow down now. Take a deep breath. All right, so obviously I had to blaze through those last 3 problems because I wanted to kind of wrap it up near to that 10-minute mark. And please understand that it does take a lot less time when I am not narrating the passage reading as I go. But let's go ahead and go over it. So again, first things first, trying to get an understanding quickly of the topic of the passage. So you know that the topic of the passage is something to do with choice, identity, free will, choice, and that has a lot to do with philosophy. And so you would kind of say, all right, free will and choice, those things are humanities passages. So that's the first step, deciding what type of passage it is. Once you kind of have a brief understanding what type of passage it is, you have an idea of what more or less to look for. So humanities passages, generally speaking, they are more opinionated. They have an idea of something that is important, and definitely more important than something else. Okay, so I'm looking for what is the thing that the author thinks is more important than the other thing. Then step 2 is to go ahead and read that last sentence. And I always have my highlighter ready. I'm highlighting for a few things. I'm highlighting for sort of shifts in tone indicators. I'm highlighting for, more prudence, so things that are emphasizing certain things. So I have emphasis words. I'm highlighting for claims. So this is a claim, like a factual sort of phrase. This represents, this is, right? That's sort of a factual claim that the author's making. So you have emphasis, you have shifts in tones, you have factual claims, you have, so must be, those are normative phrases. Normative phrases are, again, phrases that people use when they want to emphasize how the world should be. Like, hey, this must be examined. This is really, really important. Of course, the example I wanted to highlight, because if this problem here, so if there was a problem like this, then I would remember sort of more or less where that example was, and just sort of highlighting, shifts in tone, shift in tone, and then this main sort of thesis statement right here. So I had that highlighter ready, and I got the concluding sentence. And guys, this is really, really important. So when you are reading it, spend some time around the concluding sentence, spend some time around the first shift in tone, spend some time combining the two things together in your mind into what you think is the main point of the passage, because it's generally the connection between these two things that formulates the main point of the author. And so that's exactly what I did. I had a feeling that it was going to be a humanities passage because of the topic. It was philosophy. And then I got to work to see what is it that is that hierarchy of more important and less important, and the less important thing is whether or not these things exist. The more important thing is that we have to accept our inherent inadequacy. Then I kind of predicted the layout. I was wrong with the layout prediction, which is okay, because it keeps me focused and sharp on the passage at hand. Again, we want to be active readers, not passive readers. So anything that gets me to be active is better. And by making a prediction, my brain is now actively looking for the answer for that prediction, whether or not it's true. As compared to somebody who did not make any predictions, their brains are not really looking for anything in particular. And so they're kind of wandering through the passage subconsciously. We don't want that. So then we came to the top and we paused. We reminded ourselves, what is the thesis and what questions do we have? Because when you ask yourself questions, that makes you an active reader. So because the author says that it's more important to accept your own inadequacy with processing information, obviously the first question is, why is that more important? And the second question is, of course, how does the author show this? So then we started reading. And we saw these words seems, right? And seems, they're always like shift in tone indicators, right? They're sort of like setting up the author to make a shift in tone. So it's like, well, yeah, this seems this way and that seems this way, but, right? So I often notice that the word seems, they tend to kind of prime the author, gets them ready to make that shift in tone. So I'd like to highlight those. And then the shift in tone happened, and the phrase right afterwards said, the direction in which we end up doesn't bring about internal satisfaction. And so it's that internal dissatisfaction that makes it important for the author to say that we should accept our own inherent inadequacy so that we don't have to feel that that internal dissatisfaction whenever we end up in a direction where we don't like it, And so the rest of it was sort of just exemplifying that. And then we have another big shift in tone over here, where it says exactly that identifying yourself with your choices and the outcomes of those choices starts to confuse and make you doubt your own satisfaction of yourself as the person who can make good big choices. And that's why the author says it's not good to say that, because it's inherent, where it's inevitable that we're going to be inadequate in collecting all the variables, and that those variables are easy to accept that we didn't take those things into account, especially when it's tied to something insignificant. It's like, oh, if you made like a silly mistake by ordering a burger, it's like, that's not really a big deal. We're not really down on ourselves because of that. But somehow we forget that this is the same mistake that we make when we're planning big decisions as well. So the difference is that with those big decisions, all of a sudden we now are dissatisfied. So that's the interpretation that I got from the passage and what I highlighted and my approach to it. Again, it's sort of a similar approach of looking at the concluding sentence and trying to connect that with that first shift in tone thesis afterwards, and then going from there. So the problems over here, we have these types of problems. We have the reasoning, reasoning within the text. Over here, it asks us, the role of this example. We had obviously the foundations of comprehension. Over here, what is the point, right? The author's trying to make. We have a reasoning beyond the text problem over here, where it's giving you a new situation and asking you how the author would likely respond. We have a reasoning, looks like reasoning beyond the text as well here, so getting to understand which claims are outside the scope of the passage. And this one is saying, again, this could be that or reasoning within the text, depending upon how you interpret it. But this one says, suppose a research in neuroscience conclusively proves. So this is adding new information and then getting you to see how this would affect the author's argument. So that's, again, reasoning beyond the text. So we have a good mixture of the three main categories of problems of the MCAT in this passage, making you feel comfortable that this is quite similar to the sorts of problems that you'd get on the AAMC. And each of them has their own unique sort of process. So If you remember, for these types of problems where it's asking why this example was used, you have to first locate where was that example in the passage, and the way that you can locate that is by remembering, your layout of the passage. So you look at your scratch paper and you see, okay, I know that the first shift in tone was somewhere around, paragraph 1. So was that example near to the top, or somewhere in the middle, or somewhere below? When did it start? It's always about when it started. And of course, remember that it started just right after that first shift in tone. And we even highlighted the word example just to kind of cue us in to where this example started, right? It's a really important thing to highlight, the starting point of these examples. So we located it, and the next step was to locate the claim that was made previously, like just before that example was used. And that previous claim was exactly right after that first shift in tone, where it said the direction in which we end up does not bring about internal satisfaction, in which case the correct answer will be B, to illustrate how our decisions can lead us to dissatisfaction. Now, that is the reason why this is the strongest. Again, when you're choosing the answer choice that is the strongest, following these principles and also including MSLR is really important. So most supported least rationalization. So B is very, very straightforwardly follows this principle to a T. And again, with the AAMC, there's not, as much as you think there is, there's really no ambiguity. If you just stick to the process and answer the questions the way that you're learning how these problems should be answered, that will lead you to the answer confidently every time. So most likely reason, meaning that what has the most direct support around that example. So here's the claim, and then take an example of this, right? That's what you can know for sure. It follows that claim directly, and it says take an example, blah, blah, blah. That's what you know. You don't have to stretch yourself very far away from that reasoning right there. So to demonstrate our incomplete decision-making process sounded pretty nice. It did sound pretty nice. But it didn't say that our decision-making process is sort of incomplete, right? It didn't introduce that idea until the paragraph afterwards, where it says, in these situations, the process you use must be examined, right? And that we don't take it, like, that's all afterwards. But the reason why the author introduced this example in the first place followed this claim here. And so that's a perfect illustration of why these are not good answers. Even though they sound right, it's not. And of course, anything else that says, setting up the context for life is made up of choices, well, that's not a claim that the author made, right? The author is putting that in quotes, right? So just because they're putting that in quotes, that means that the author is actually disassociating themselves with that claim. So they're not making this claim. It's not like the author is saying, hey, life is made up of choices. It's just saying that is a common saying, right? In quotes, like, hey, how they say life is made up of choices. Well, this represents blah, blah, right? So the author is not really identifying him or herself with that claim. They're just making it to kind of be cute and sort of set up some context for this claim. Makes sense? So that's why this is wrong. To exemplify the level of detail necessary when examining our own decisions. And again, there's nothing in here that sort of talks about that beforehand. That all of those details and factors and stuff like that, it's all over here. It's all over here and over here. So that would follow the same logic of why A is wrong as well. Okay? The point that the author is trying to make, and again, with these types of problems, we must remember the combination of what's after the first shift in tone and what the concluding statements are. Those combination of those two things formulate what we can know as the main point of the author. And so again, the main point being it's more prudent to accept our inherent inadequacy when it comes to processing information. And why is it more important? Because when we feel like it doesn't bring about internal satisfaction, right? So like when the outcome of our choices leads to dissatisfaction, that's not a good thing, the author says. You shouldn't feel dissatisfied with your ability to make choices, because you should realize that this is something that's going to happen, regardless of if it's a big choice or a small choice. So that's the main point. And so again, you bracket it. You got to bracket it, and you got to do MSLR when making your decision of what's the strongest of the bracket. So A versus B, the pursuit of improving our information processing capabilities is worthwhile. And again, that's not really something that the author says, and you know that, right? Like, they're not talking about how you should improve our information processing capabilities. And if you do argue that, you're going to be pointing to places like this statement right here, like this phrase right here. To go about improving this process would mean to accept blah, 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 right? That the author's not saying you should go about improving it. It's just saying, you know, if you went about improving this process, that means that you already accept that there's a process that needs improving in the first place. And you're only doing that because it's an insignificant choice. And that's not what I'm saying. On the other hand, when the choice is more significant, now all of a sudden you don't realize that you need to, that there's anything that you need to improve. Right? So the author is not really saying that this is the main point. It's actually trying to say that the need of improvement is more important to understand. Like the fact that you need improving, that's the point. So our intentions are not always in our best interests. So, you know, regardless of what you know, if A seemed to be a bit stronger, if B didn't seem that strong, you know, our intentions are not always in our best interests. Because again, that's not a claim that the author's making, that we intend to bring about, you know, sort of undesirable outcomes, right? The author's just trying to say that the reason why those outcomes happen is because of our poor information processing capabilities. So that's why I crossed this out. I was like, the author's not at all saying that we are intending to harm ourselves. A versus C. Sometimes there are choices in life that are made for us instead of by us. Again, the author doesn't really care, regardless of whether or not choices, identity, and free will are existing. The author doesn't really care about that. So the idea that choices are predetermined for us is not necessarily something that's very important. So either one you can cross off. You can cross off C, and then D says or you know, I think I crossed off A in the original run, so we can cross off that. And then so to loosen the sense of self-worth tied to the outcomes of our choices, that's basically what it's trying to say. You know, like let go of the fact that for these big significant choices, that you know you're somehow should be dissatisfied with yourself for the outcome of your choices. There's no need to be dissatisfied. And you know, the sense of self-worth, meaning that internal satisfaction that was being spoken about in that first shift in tone right here, right? That's exactly what the author is trying to say. So again, as long as you are as long as you are really by the book, and you try not to vary yourself too much, because again, you know, one of the common things is that the more difficult an answer choice is to understand, oftentimes we select that answer because we think, well, we're dumb and the MCAT is smart, and so we must choose the answer that's the most confusing. And that's completely illogical. Never do that. Always choose the answer that makes the most sense to you, because that's at least going to give you the highest probability of getting that right. So the more question marks that you feel, the weaker it is. Right? If this is pretty straightforward, saying it's about the sense of self-worth, it's about satisfaction, because the main components have to do with those two things. Again, internal dissatisfaction and being able to accept your own inherent inadequacy. Those two things are the two components. And none of the other choices talk about how we should accept our inherent inadequacy, because we should not, because of that internal dissatisfaction that occurs. Nothing of these four choices, apart from D, talks about the internal dissatisfaction that comes when choices don't end up the way we want, right? So it's really important to take that in consideration. That's the one that checks off that box. This one says, you know, how would the author respond to this situation? And again, these types of problems are basically just trying to get you to understand the main point the author's trying to make, and then just applying it to this new situation. So again, A is saying exactly that it's okay. It makes sense that you failed, because you can accept, right, that you are inadequate, inherently with respect to this processing of information, but this does not mean you're incapable of improvement, right? So the fact that this person begins questioning their ability, that's exactly what they're trying to say, that, you know, all of a sudden, you know, when big important choices and outcomes happen the way that we don't like, now all of a sudden we are lacking internal satisfaction. We're confused with our own ability to be the captain of our choices in the future. But that's not what the author says is prudent. That yes, it's reasonable that you failed, but that doesn't mean that you're not, you know, capable of improving in the future. It's acceptable to doubt yourself, because in doing so you will become humble. This part is fine, but this part is not fine. So that's why B is weak. C, so you failed because you were unaware of all the appropriate information needed to best determine the correct answers of your exam. Okay, then again, that's fair, right? That's definitely part of it. But A tackles both it being reasonable that you failed, and also the fact of the self-worth component, which is the main point the author's trying to make. So C is good, it has support, but it's not as supported as A. You failed because of variables beyond your control, and so it is your destiny to fail the exam in the future, so that's obviously wrong. Because again, whether or not we have free will or destiny or whatever, that's not what the author is trying to say. So D is wrong. Being least supported by the passage, again, either it's a claim or it's not a claim. So there's going to be 3 claims in this answer choice, and there's going to be one that's not a claim. We have to find the one that's not a claim. So A, right off the bat, is not a claim, right? That the fact that these things are illusions, no, the author never says that. They're saying regardless of whether or not these things exist, that's not what the author's trying to say. The other point says identification with the outcomes of our choices represents the root of modern day anxiety. It's obviously good. Planning for future behavior is complex. Yep. It is easy to accept our inadequacy from failed but insignificant predictions. Yes, like if we eat a hamburger, it's like that's not a big deal. Pretty easy to accept the fact that we didn't take into consideration all the variables necessary. Suppose this conclusively proves that choices are predetermined. Again, that does not affect the author's argument. This is because, again, the author uses the word regardless of whether or not there is such a thing. It doesn't matter. Okay? Excellent, guys. So, again, keep on drilling those problem types. Make sure you understand those processes that we use to solve each problem type. Please understand what the different topics are regarding each passage type, and why humanities passages work one way and social science passages work another way. Then make sure that you are, going the bottom up, trying to understand the concluding sentence, the layout of the passage, predicting where that first shift in tone is, pausing at the top, asking yourself those questions so that you can become an active reader when you do read from top down, and then start to look for that first shift in tone. Just pause for a second over here again, connect the first shift in tone thesis with the concluding sentence thesis, and then read the rest of it comfortably, casually, easily, getting your highlighter out and highlighting those normative phrases, emphasis phrases, shifts in tones, claims, and so on. Alright guys, I'll see you in the next passage.